So it's April 2017. Inside this brightly lit supermarket in Nagoya, a 70-year-old man gets quietly pulled aside by store security, and inside his pockets, they find like a single watermelon, a few cheap rice balls, and some discounted side dishes. The total value of his haul? Less than 30 bucks. Now, when the cops arrive, the old man doesn't even put up a fight. He doesn't pull a weapon, he doesn't yell, he just looks down at his worn-out shoes, totally defeated, and confesses to the officers, "The group is so poor, we gotta steal food just to survive." Like, if you looked at this frail, impoverished pensioner, you'd probably see a tragic symptom of Japan's aging population, right? Just a sad old man left behind by society. But you'd be entirely wrong. See, when the police ran his fingerprints down at the station, they didn't find some forgotten grandfather. They found a high-ranking boss within the Kobe Yamaguchi-gumi, which is literally one of the deadliest factions of the Japanese Mafia. Crazy, right? Because 30 years before this pathetic grocery store arrest, this exact same man was completely untouchable. He wore bespoke Italian suits, he drove imported Mercedes-Benzes, and he walked the neon-lit streets of Kabukicho like a literal king. In the 1980s, the Yakuza weren't stealing watermelons, they extorted multinational corporations, they ran billion-dollar real estate rackets, and they practically co-managed the world's second-largest economy. They were the most organized, wealthiest, and most feared criminal syndicate on the planet. Like, cops bowed to them in the streets, major politicians begged for their endorsements behind closed doors. But today, the Japanese underworld isn't dying in a blaze of cinematic gunfire. It's dying of starvation, old age, and total irrelevance. So how does that even happen? How did an organization that survived world wars, rival syndicates, and centuries of evolution get reduced to shoplifting discounted groceries? And honestly, more importantly, what was the invisible, perfectly designed weapon the Japanese government used to quietly strangle the life right out of them? Now, before the neon lights, the billions of yen, and the devastating collapse, the Yakuza had to be forged, and they were forged in the fires of a country that had absolutely nothing left to lose. But listen, before we trace the rise of the bear and the birth of the Yamaguchi-gumi, you gotta decide right now if you're in or out. On this channel, we don't really do surface-level history. We dismantle the world's most dangerous secrets. So do me a favor, break your own code of silence and hit that subscribe button. Welcome to Breaking Omerta. Now let's head back to the ruins of 1945. So picture August 1945. Japan is literally a graveyard. The firebombings have basically turned major cities into endless plains of charred wood and ash. The empire has fallen, the emperor has surrendered on the radio, and the economy has entirely evaporated. For the millions of Japanese citizens left standing, the only law that actually mattered was the law of survival. The government was completely paralyzed. The American occupation forces, led by General MacArthur, were just totally overwhelmed trying to rebuild a fractured society. If you wanted to eat, you couldn't rely on the state. The state had nothing. You had to go to the yamaichi, the black markets. These black markets were the only places keeping the country from starving to death, but they were lawless, incredibly violent zones. Thugs, disbanded soldiers who had just come back from the front lines, and foreign gangs fought bloody turf wars over scraps of food, stolen military rations, and black market penicillin. The local police, they were unarmed, demoralized, and just entirely useless. The people needed protection, and into this massive vacuum stepped the outcasts. Now get this, before the war, the ancestors of the Yakuza were just wandering peddlers known as tekiya and underground gamblers known as bakuto. They were literally the lowest of the low on the Japanese social ladder. Society absolutely despised them. But in the ruins of 1945, they realized something profound. Order was the ultimate currency. These loose bands of outcasts banded together. They patrolled the black markets, they kept the rival gangs out, they resolved disputes, they provided brutal, immediate justice where the police couldn't. For the desperate citizens of Japan, these criminals weren't a menace anymore. They were a necessary evil. The Yakuza branded themselves as followers of Ninkyo, which is this ancient code of chivalry that roughly translates to help the weak, fight the strong. It was brilliant marketing. And in the port city of Kobe, absolutely nobody manipulated this code better than a young, terrifying street fighter named Kazuo Tauka. Tauka was the very definition of a man with nothing to lose. Orphaned at a young age, he grew up in the filthy, poverty-stricken docks of Kobe. He was a vicious brawler with a signature move that sounds like something out of a horror movie. In the middle of a street fight, he would physically gouge out the eyes of his opponents with his bare fingers. He earned the nickname Kuma, or the Bear. But Tauka was way more than just a violent street enforcer. He was a visionary. In 1946, at just 33 years old, Tauka took control of the Yamaguchi-gumi. Now, at the time, this group was really nothing more than a small, disorganized crew of about 36 dock workers. He looked at the chaos of post-war Japan and realized that violence alone wasn't going to build an empire. He needed loyalty. He needed a family. So, Tauka instituted this rigid, pseudo-religious family structure. He utilized the Oyabun-Kobun system, the father-child relationship. When a young, starving street kid joined the Yamaguchi-gumi, he'd drink from the exact same sake cup as Tauka. And in that moment, the kid wasn't an orphan anymore. He was a son of the Yakuza. His biological family ceased to matter. His life, his blood, and his absolute obedience now belonged to the boss. And to guarantee this loyalty, they embraced the extreme. They covered their bodies in agonizingly painful traditional tattoos, irezumi. And these weren't just little tattoos, these were full-body suits that took hundreds of hours and thousands of dollars to complete using traditional bamboo needles. It was a permanent branding that alienated them from normal society forever. Like, once you were inked, you could never go back to a civilian life. You couldn't even go to a public bathhouse without everyone knowing exactly what you were. And if you made a mistake, you didn't just apologize to the boss, you performed yubitsume, the ritual amputation of your own pinky finger. You'd chop it off yourself, wrap it in a little cloth, and hand it over to your boss as payment for your screw-up. It was this brutal piece of psychological engineering. See, in ancient times, missing a pinky meant you couldn't grip a samurai sword properly, forcing you to rely even more on your brothers for protection in battle. It made you permanently dependent on the gang. Anyway, under Tauoka's iron-fisted corporate-style leadership, the Yamaguchi-gumi transformed from a group of 30 street toughs into a disciplined, fanatical army. Tauoka expanded their reach far beyond gambling and black markets. He realized that the real money was in the rebuilding of Japan itself. He took over the labor unions on the docks, but he didn't stop there. He created legitimate talent agencies to control the post-war entertainment industry. Like Kazuo Tauoka literally managed the careers of Japan's biggest pop stars and actors. He was a Hollywood-level mogul by day and a mafia don by night. He extorted the massive construction firms that were rebuilding the country's infrastructure, and by providing political muscle to conservative politicians who wanted to keep left-wing communist agitators at bay, Tauoka basically ensured the cops looked the other way. He was building an unstoppable machine. But this raw, unchecked ambition was about to drag the Yakuza out of the shadows and into an era of unprecedented wealth, bloodshed, and hubris. The Japanese economic miracle had begun, and the underworld was about to claim its massive, bloody share. So, by the 1960s and 70s, the ash and rubble of post-war Japan had been swept away, replaced by steel, glass, and unbridled capitalism. The country was experiencing an economic miracle the likes of which the modern world had never seen. Japan wasn't just recovering, it was becoming a global superpower. Manufacturing was booming, the yen was strengthening, and the real estate market was beginning a climb that would eventually defy all logic. But as the country traded its black markets for boardrooms, the Yakuza faced a massive paradigm shift. The street-level extortion and dockland gambling rings that Tauoka had used to build the Yamaguchi-gumi just weren't enough to sustain a massive nationwide army anymore. If the Yakuza wanted to survive this new economic miracle, they couldn't just be gangsters anymore. They had to become businessmen. And this is exactly where the Yakuza outsmarted the old guard of the criminal underworld. While the American Mafia was busy shooting each other in the streets of New York over garbage contracts and hijacking trucks, the Yakuza took off their brass knuckles and put on Rolexes. They realized that in a booming corporate economy, the most dangerous weapon wasn't a gun. It was a share of stock. They pioneered a form of corporate extortion known as sokaya. So the sokaya system was basically a masterclass in psychological warfare, perfectly weaponizing the Japanese cultural obsession with face and public reputation. Here's how it worked, and it's honestly genius. A Yakuza syndicate would buy a single share of stock in a major publicly traded corporation, let's say a massive electronics company or a global automotive bank. As a shareholder, they now had the legal right to attend the company's annual general meeting. Next, the Yakuza's private investigators would dig up dirt on the company's execs. They'd find out about embezzled funds, secret mistresses, illegitimate children, or defective products that the company had secretly covered up. Days before the annual meeting, the Yakuza would approach the CEO. The threat was elegant and devastating. Pay us an exorbitant consulting fee, or we're going to show up at your shareholder meeting, seize the microphone, and scream your darkest secrets to the press and your investors. And in a society where public shame is considered a fate worse than death, corporate executives almost never called the police. They just opened their checkbooks. They paid millions just to keep the meetings quiet and perfectly choreographed. By the 1970s and 80s, the Yakuza were extracting hundreds of millions of dollars directly from the treasuries of Japan's most prestigious, internationally recognized brands. But corporate blackmail was really just the appetizer. The main course was real estate. As Japan entered the bubble era of the late 1980s, the real estate market completely lost its mind. To give you an idea of how insane it was, at the peak of the bubble, the land sitting underneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was valued higher than all the real estate in the entire state of California combined. Corporate developers were absolutely desperate to build new skyscrapers, but Japan has incredibly strict tenant protection laws. You couldn't just evict people to demolish an old apartment building. Unless, of course, you hired the jigeya. I mean, it's crazy, right? These guys went from ruling boardrooms to being excommunicated from society by a few lines of fine print. If you're enjoying this deep dive into how the Yakuza actually collapsed, you're definitely one of us. So consider making your sub status official by joining the family. Subscribe now so you never miss a briefing. We're dropping stories like this every week that the mainstream usually keeps quiet. Anyway, back to the jigeya and how they terrorized Tokyo. So the jigeya were specialized Yakuza eviction crews. Legitimate multi-billion-dollar real estate developers would secretly hire Yakuza fronts to clear out stubborn tenants, and the tactics were pure terror. The Yakuza would blast deafening military march music outside apartments at 3 a.m. They'd pour raw sewage through mail slots. They'd leave dead animals on doorsteps. They'd anonymously threaten the lives of the tenants' kids on their way to school. Within weeks, the terrified civilians would sell their homes for pennies on the dollar and just flee for their lives. The Yakuza would then flip the newly emptied, highly valuable land to the corporate developers for a staggering profit. And the cops? Well, the cops were often bribed or politically pressured by the very politicians the Yakuza helped fund, so they just looked the other way. It was a perfectly corrupt ecosystem. By the late 1980s, the Yakuza had achieved a level of power and mainstream integration that no criminal organization in human history has ever matched. And I'm not exaggerating here. Just to give you an idea of how much money we're talking about, during the late 80s, Yakuza bosses weren't just buying sports cars. They were buying up impressionist paintings, like actual Picassos and Renoirs. Why? Because high-end art was the ultimate way to launder billions of yen. They would literally walk into a major bank, completely covered in tattoos, missing fingers, and the bank manager would rush out bowing to hand them multi-million-dollar loans with zero collateral. It was absurd. It was like they were playing Grand Theft Auto but with the infinite money glitch turned on. They weren't hiding in the shadows at all. They operated out of massive, legally registered office buildings with brass plaques on the front doors. They had corporate logos on their business cards. They even published their own fan magazines, like actual magazines you could buy that featured poetry written by the bosses, photos of their fishing trips, and interviews. Like, if you were a high-ranking boss in the Yamaguchi-gumi, you were treated with the reverence of a Fortune 500 CEO. You golfed with prime ministers. You went to the best restaurants. When a massive earthquake hit Kobe in 1995, it was the Yakuza, not the government, who were the first to deploy fleets of trucks and helicopters to hand out diapers, food, and water to the victims, which was this brilliant PR move that solidified their untouchable status in the eyes of the public. They had successfully hacked the Japanese economy. They were generating an estimated $100 billion a year. They believed they were this immortal, indispensable gear in the machine of the nation. They were completely and utterly on top of the world. But in this life, every crown comes with a target, and the Yakuza, blinded by their billions and their unbelievable hubris, failed to realize that the economic bubble protecting them was about to burst. And when the money dried up, the very government that had quietly used them for decades was preparing to forge a weapon designed to wipe them off the face of the earth. So, in 1991, the greatest financial party in human history abruptly ended. The Japanese asset bubble violently burst. Stock prices evaporated. Real estate values plummeted by up to 80%. Almost overnight, the overflowing rivers of corporate cash that had transformed the Yakuza into billionaires simply dried up. But losing money wasn't the real disaster. The real disaster was that the Yakuza were no longer useful to the elites. During the boom, corporate Japan and conservative politicians happily used the Yakuza as their private fixers. But in the devastating recession that followed, this era they call the Lost Decade, those same executives suddenly viewed their underworld partners as dangerous liabilities. The shield of political protection that had covered the Yamaguchi-gumi and their rivals was violently ripped away. And waiting right behind that shield was the Yakuza's ultimate antagonist, a Japanese public that had finally had enough. For decades, the Yakuza had survived by clinging to their foundational myth of ninkyo, the chivalrous code of protecting the weak. The Japanese public had tolerated their gambling rings and prostitution fronts as long as the violence stayed strictly between criminals. But as the recession deepened and the Yakuza grew desperate for cash to maintain their lavish lifestyles, their fatal flaw was fully exposed: their unquenchable, arrogant greed. They stopped being noble outlaws and became predators. They began shaking down small mom-and-pop restaurants. They pushed heavy narcotics, which was a huge taboo. They fought bloody, reckless turf wars in broad daylight, catching innocent bystanders in the crossfire. But the ultimate point of no return, the moment that permanently shattered their untouchable aura, happened on a quiet Tokyo evening in May of 1992. Juzo Itami was one of Japan's most famous and beloved film directors. He had recently released a blockbuster comedy called Minbo, a movie that dared to do the unthinkable. It openly mocked the Yakuza. Itami depicted them not as honorable samurai, but as pathetic, cowardly bullies who only backed down when ordinary people stood up to them. The Yakuza were humiliated. Their obsession with face and public respect demanded a response. So 3 enforcers from the Goto-gumi faction ambushed Itami outside his home and brutally slashed his face and neck with knives. They thought this act of terror would silence their critics. Instead, it literally signed their death warrant. Attacking a beloved civilian over a comedy film crossed the ultimate invisible line. The public outrage was deafening. The government, terrified of looking weak, struck back with a weapon far more devastating than bullets. They used the bureaucracy. In 1992, Japan passed the Botaiho, the anti-Boryokudan law. For the first time, police were given sweeping, aggressive powers to designate Yakuza syndicates as violent threat groups. But here is the shocking paradox of Japanese law. The Botaiho didn't actually make it illegal to be a Yakuza. The Japanese Constitution protects the right to freedom of assembly, meaning you could technically still walk into a police station, hand them your Yakuza business card, and walk out a free man. Instead, the government engineered a brilliant, suffocating game of cat and mouse. They didn't aim for the Yakuza's bodies. They aimed for their bank accounts. As the years progressed, the laws escalated into the devastating Yakuza Exclusion Ordinances, implemented nationwide by 2011. And guys, these laws were a masterpiece of financial strangulation. If you were a known member of the Yakuza, you were effectively excommunicated from modern society. You could not open a bank account, you could not sign a lease for an apartment, you couldn't even get a credit card. You couldn't even legally sign a contract for a cell phone. If a Yakuza boss wanted to buy a car, he couldn't get insurance. If he got into a minor fender bender, he could be arrested for massive fraud simply because he hid his gang affiliation from the insurance company. There's literally a story of a top boss getting arrested because he used his wife's name to get a golf course membership. That's how petty and strict the laws were. But the true genius of the exclusion ordinances was that they weaponized the civilian population against the mob. The law stated that any legitimate business caught knowingly providing services to the Yakuza would be warned by the police. If they did it again, the police would publicly publish the business's name on the internet, shaming them and effectively destroying their reputation overnight. Suddenly, golf courses banned Yakuza members. Luxury hotels refused to let them book rooms. Even public bathhouses, the traditional sanctuaries where Yakuza proudly displayed their tattoos, put up signs explicitly banning them. And it didn't just affect the men, it affected their families. Imagine being a Yakuza boss and suddenly your kid gets expelled from their private daycare just because of your last name. Your wife tries to set up a basic everyday grocery delivery service and the company cancels the account because taking your money is suddenly a crime. It was total social excommunication. The invincible mobsters who once extorted billions from international corporations were suddenly radioactive. Legitimate society had built an invisible, impenetrable wall around them, slowly cutting off their oxygen. The stakes had fundamentally changed. This was no longer a game of expanding territory or making millions. This was a desperate, claustrophobic struggle simply to survive the month. The syndicates were bleeding money, bleeding members, and losing their grip on reality. When you take an army of violent, deeply paranoid men, trap them in a cage, and strip away their wealth, they don't just quietly fade away. They look for someone to blame. The Japanese government had successfully armed the trap. Now all they had to do was wait for the Yakuza to tear themselves apart from the inside. Now, by 2015, the Japanese government's financial siege had worked flawlessly. The Yakuza were suffocating. Membership had plummeted from a peak of over 100,000 men down to less than 30,000. And the ones who stayed, they weren't the young, hungry street fighters of Kazuo Taoka's era. They were old men. The average age of a Yakuza member had actually crept past 50. But while the soldiers on the street were barking for scraps, the men at the very top of the pyramid refused to accept reality. And this disconnect would be the catalyst for their ultimate destruction. So get this, Kenichi Shinoda, the supreme boss of the Yamaguchi-gumi, lived a life completely insulated from the devastating effects of these laws. He still demanded jonokin, a mandatory monthly tribute from every single affiliated gang beneath him. Now, in the golden era of the bubble economy, kicking $1,000,000 up to the boss every month was pocket change. But in 2015, for a lower-level boss who couldn't even legally open a bank account or rent an office space, finding that kind of cash was mathematically impossible. The lower ranks were forced to cannibalize their own neighborhoods, shaking down impoverished shop owners and running petty scams just to pay their tribute. The pressure cooker was screaming, and in August of 2015, the Yamaguchi-gumi, the unstoppable empire that had survived for 100 years, finally reached its point of no return. 13 of the Yamaguchi-gumi's top lieutenants, mostly based in the original stronghold of Kobe, decided they'd had enough. They mutinied. They broke away from Shinoda's rule and formed a rival syndicate, the Kobe Yamaguchi-gumi. Now, in the underworld, betrayal is a capital offense. A split of this magnitude meant only one thing: war. The public braced for a bloodbath. They expected a return to the terrifying gang wars of the 1980s, where heavily armed hit squads would shoot up rival headquarters with military-grade weapons. But that isn't what happened, because the men fighting this war weren't cinematic assassins. They were geriatric grandfathers who could barely afford the bus fare to get to the hit. And the absolute craziest part of this war, because these guys were so old and so watched by the cops, they literally started suing each other. Like actual lawsuits filed in Japanese courts over who owned the rights to the gang's logo and their office buildings. Imagine the American Mafia hiring corporate lawyers to fight over a trademark. It was humiliating. They even launched PR websites to try and win over public opinion. And honestly, no single moment captures the tragic, pathetic reality of the modern Yakuza better than a quiet Monday afternoon in the city of Amagasaki. So, it's November 2019. A senior boss from the breakaway Kobe faction is walking toward his safe house. He isn't surrounded by an army of bodyguards. He's literally carrying his own groceries. Across the street, an assassin is waiting. But this hitman isn't a young, sharp-suited enforcer looking to make a name for himself. He's a 52-year-old man named Hisanori Asano, a loyalist to the main Yamaguchi-gumi.
Asano raises an assault rifle and pulls the trigger. The target is hit multiple times and collapses onto the pavement, the plastic grocery bag spilling cheap noodles and tea onto the concrete. It's a fatal, gruesome assassination. But it's what happens next that delivers the final crushing blow to the Yakuza's mythical legacy. In the movies, the assassin escapes into the night, but in reality, the 52-year-old hitman is too old, too tired, and too poor to run. He simply walks to the side of the road, drops his weapon, and sits on the curb, just waiting for the cops to arrive. When the officers tackle him to the ground, he doesn't resist. He later confesses that he actually wanted to be caught. Because for the modern Yakuza foot soldier, an assassination is no longer a path to glory, money, or promotion. It's a retirement plan. By committing a high-profile murder in the name of the boss, these aging gangsters guarantee themselves a life sentence in a Japanese federal prison. And for Yakuza in the 21st century, prison is paradise. It means 3 warm meals a day. It means a bed. It means state-funded healthcare for their failing geriatric bodies. The Japanese prison system actually has dedicated elderly care wards now, with nurses and handrails, because so many inmates are senior citizens. It means they no longer have to worry about the Exclusion Ordinances or stealing watermelons just to survive the winter. The greatest criminal empire in Asian history wasn't defeated by a rival gang, and it wasn't taken down in a massive shootout. It was starved to death by bureaucrats until its most lethal enforcers were reduced to begging the government to lock them up just so they could eat. So today, the Yamaguchi-gumi and their rivals are little more than ghosts haunting the edges of a society that has entirely moved on without them. The grand office buildings have been seized or sold. The extravagant annual parties are illegal. The feared bosses of the bubble economy are now elderly men navigating a world that tracks their every financial move with algorithms and facial recognition. But nature abhors a vacuum, and the Japanese underworld is no different. The billions of dollars in illicit markets didn't just disappear when the Yakuza were suffocated out of existence. The demand for vice, for scams, for illegal gambling, that didn't go away. The money simply changed hands. The empire the Yakuza built over a century wasn't conquered by another mafia. It was inherited by the Hangure. Hangure translates roughly to half-gray. They're a new breed of decentralized, highly fluid criminal networks. They don't have business cards, they don't have legally registered offices, they don't cut off their fingers, and they certainly don't cover themselves in full-body tattoos that make them instantly recognizable to the police. They look like completely normal kids.
And these Hangure guys, they are absolutely ruthless. See, the old Yakuza had this whole PR thing, right? The Ninkyo Code. They tried to pretend they were honorable protectors of the community. The Hangure do not care about honor. They run these massive, complex network scams. They also use something called Yami Baito, which translates to dark part-time jobs. They literally go on Twitter or Telegram and post job ads targeting desperate teenagers. They hire a kid for a few $100 to go rob a jewelry store or act as a mule for a scam. The kid gets caught, takes the fall, and the Hangure bosses at the top just delete their Telegram accounts and vanish. It's gig economy organized crime. It's completely disposable. The old school Yakuza used to look down on that kind of stuff. They thought it was completely beneath them to rob a grandma or use a teenager as cannon fodder. They believed in lifetime employment, but the Hangures, they just see a target. They're basically tech bros, but for, organized crime. To the Hangure, the Yakuza aren't respected elders. They're absolute dinosaurs. When you look back at the incredible, bloody 100-year arc of the Yakuza, you're forced to confront a staggering, tragic irony. Like, Kazuo Taka built the Yamaguchi-gumi by making them hyper-visible. He demanded complete, irreversible commitment. He mandated the tattoos so his men could never blend back into normal society. He built massive corporate headquarters so the public would know exactly who was in charge. He created a rigid, recognizable brand because, in the chaotic aftermath of World War II, visibility meant power. It meant respect. It meant nobody messed with you. But it was precisely that visibility that doomed them. By insisting on operating in the open, by proudly wearing their affiliations like corporate badges, they gave the Japanese government the ultimate weapon. The bureaucracy didn't have to hunt them down in the shadows. They didn't have to wiretap secret meetings. They knew exactly who they were, where they lived, and where they banked. The Yakuza spent a century forging a brotherhood based on pride and absolute, unquestioning loyalty to the crest. But in the end, it was that exact pride, their desperate, arrogant need to be seen and respected as the kings of Japan, that allowed the law to simply erase them from the map with a bunch of paperwork. They survived firebombings, rival armies, and the bursting of the greatest economic bubble in history, but they couldn't survive their own hubris. The Yakuza tried to play a legal game in an illegal world, and it literally cost them everything. Like, the Yakuza's biggest mistake was thinking they were too big to fail. And honestly, our goal is to make sure these stories are never forgotten. So if you made it to the end, you've officially broken Omerta with me today. Make sure you check if that bell icon is active so you're the first to know when the next file drops. So you definitely aren't going to want to miss that. Drop a comment with your take on the Yakuza's downfall. I literally read every single one. Stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.